The morning sun streamed through the blinds as Alexander Reed hunched over his laptop, dark circles under his eyes. For the fifth time that week, he hadn't come to bed until past 3 a.m. Elena watched him from the doorway, a cup of tea in her trembling hands. She'd prepared his favorite breakfast, hoping to finally have the conversation they'd been putting off. "Alex," she said softly, "can we talk?" He didn't look up. "I have a meeting in 30 minutes. The investors are getting antsy." "It's important," Elena insisted. "Please, just 5 minutes." Alexander sighed and closed his laptop. His company was weeks away from securing its first major round of funding. What had started in their garage 2 years ago was about to make them rich, if everything went according to plan. "What is it?" he asked, finally meeting her eyes. Elena took a deep breath. "I'm pregnant." The words hung in the air between them. Alexander's face went blank, then pale. He stood up so quickly his chair fell backward. That's not possible." "We were careful," he stammered, running his hands through his already messy hair. "I'm 12 weeks along," Elena said, tears forming in her eyes. "I wanted to be sure before I told you." Alexander paced the kitchen, his mind racing. A baby? Now? The timing couldn't be worse. His company needed every ounce of his energy, every minute of his time. A child would ruin everything he'd worked for. "Did you do this on purpose?" he asked suddenly, his voice cold. Elena stepped back as if he'd slapped her. "What?" "The timing is just so convenient, isn't it? Right when the company is about to take off." His eyes narrowed. "You never supported my dreams. You said I was spending too much time working. Is this your way of forcing me to choose?" "How can you say that?" Elena whispered, tears now flowing freely. "We've been married for 4 years. We talked about having children someday." "Someday, not now." Alexander slammed his fist on the counter. "I can't believe you would do this to me." For the next week, he barely spoke to Elena. He left the house before she woke up and returned long after she went to bed. When they did cross paths, he acted like she was a stranger who happened to live in his house. Elena tried everything to reach him. She cooked his favorite meals, left him notes, even called his office, but he had built a wall she couldn't break through. Then came the morning she woke up to find his closet half empty and a note on the kitchen counter. Just 3 sentences. "I can't do this. Don't try to find me. I've transferred enough money to cover the next 6 months." Elena collapsed onto the floor, the cold tile against her cheek as she stopped. She'd known things were bad, but she never imagined he would simply leave. She didn't know that Alexander had already accepted an offer to relocate his company to Silicon Valley, that he had already signed a lease on a new apartment, that he had been planning his escape for weeks, the pregnancy just giving him the final push he needed. As his plane took off that afternoon, Alexander stared out the window at the city below, getting smaller and smaller until it disappeared completely. He deleted Elena's number from his phone, blocked her email, and instructed his lawyer to handle any divorce paperwork. In his mind, he was cutting away dead weight that would only drag him down. The guilt came in waves during those first few weeks, usually in the quiet hours of the night. But Alexander became skilled at pushing it away. He threw himself into his work with renewed intensity. His company needed him. The world needed his ideas. Elena and the baby, they would be fine without him. She was strong. She would move on. And so would he. Without looking back. Without wondering about the life growing inside the woman he once promised to love forever. What Alexander didn't know, couldn't know, was that fate had a surprise waiting for him. One that would shatter his carefully constructed new life when he least expected it. 5 years flew by in a blur of business meetings, private jets, and headline-making success. Alexander Reed was no longer just a promising entrepreneur. He was the face of ReedTech, a company valued at over $12 billion. His corner office overlooked the San Francisco Bay, glass walls stretching from floor to ceiling. Alexander stood with his hands in the pockets of a suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent, watching the fog roll in. "Mr. Reed?" His assistant, Olivia, knocked lightly on the doorframe. "Time for your interview with Tech Today." Alexander nodded, straightening his tie. These days, his life unfolded in 15-minute increments, each block on his calendar worth thousands of dollars. The interview went like dozens before it. The journalist asked about his overnight success, as if the years of grinding work counted for nothing. They asked about his vision, his investments, his advice for young entrepreneurs. "And what about your personal life, Mr. Reed? Any special someone sharing in this remarkable success story?" Alexander flashed his practiced smile. "The company keeps me pretty busy, but yes, I've been seeing someone. It's still new." What he didn't mention was that still new meant 3 months, exactly how long his relationships tended to last before falling apart. Before the women in his life realized that Reed would always come first. Later that evening, Alexander attended a charity gala he partly funded. He wrote a check for $5 million, posed for photos with celebrities, and left early. The old him would have stayed, networked, maybe even enjoyed himself. But these gatherings had become performances, not pleasures. His driver took him back to his penthouse minus 6,000 square feet of minimalist luxury that somehow still felt empty. Alexander kicked off his shoes and poured himself a drink, then walked out onto his terrace. The city lights sparkled below, beautiful but distant, like stars you could see but never touch. He pulled out his phone and found himself typing Elena Reed into the search bar before he could stop himself. He did this sometimes, usually after events like tonight's, usually after drinking. Her social media was private. It always had been. But her business profile showed up, Elena's Events, a small but well-reviewed event planning company in their hometown. The profile picture showed her smiling, looking somehow both older and more vibrant than he remembered. Alexander quickly closed the browser. What was the point? She'd moved on. He'd moved on. That night, he dreamed of the house they'd shared, of Elena's laugh, of the baby they never had. He woke up with his heart pounding, reaching for someone who wasn't there. The next morning brought a board meeting. His newest product line was performing even better than projected. His wealth had increased by another $1 billion just in the last quarter. "Congratulations, Alexander," said Thomas, his longest-serving board member, clapping him on the back afterward. "You've truly built something remarkable." "Thanks," Alexander replied automatically. "You know what the best part of success is?" Thomas continued, not waiting for an answer. "Being able to share it with the people you love. My wife still talks about that trip we took to celebrate our first major contract. 20 years ago now." Alexander nodded, forcing a smile. Thomas had no idea about Elena. Nobody here did. He'd scrubbed that chapter from his official story. That afternoon, his PR team prepped him for an upcoming school visit, a photo opportunity at an elementary school that would receive funding from his foundation. The script was simple: shake hands, smile with children, announce the donation. "This will soften your image," his PR director explained. "People relate to billionaires more when they see them interacting with kids." Alexander nearly laughed at the irony. That night, as his private chef prepared a meal he would barely taste, Alexander found himself staring at his reflection in the window. He had everything he'd ever wanted. The success, the money, the freedom. So why did it feel like he was still running from something? And why, despite all the noise and activity of his busy life, did the silence still feel so loud? What Alexander didn't know was that his carefully constructed world was about to collide with the past he thought he'd left behind. And nothing, not his billions, not his influence, not his power, would prepare him for what was coming. The elementary school buzzed with excitement. Children peered from classrooms as Alexander's entourage moved through the hallways. The principal, a short woman with a perpetual smile, couldn't stop thanking him for the donation. "This means everything to our students, Mr. Reed. The new computer lab will open so many doors for them." Alexander nodded politely. He'd done this dozens of times before, smiled for cameras, cut ribbons, shaken tiny hands. His mind was already on his afternoon flight back to San Francisco. "We'd love for you to visit a classroom," the principal said. "The first graders have prepared something special." His PR director gave an enthusiastic thumbs up from behind the principal's back. "Perfect photo opportunity." "Of course," Alexander replied smoothly. "Lead the way." They stopped outside room 103. A colorful sign on the door read, "Ms. Chen's first grade." The principal knocked twice before opening the door. "Children, our special guest is here." 20 small faces turned toward him. Some looked excited, others confused. Alexander put on his billionaire smile and stepped into the classroom. Ms. Chen, a young teacher with glasses, clapped her hands. "Okay, everyone, remember the psalm we practiced." The children shuffled to the front of the room, forming two uneven lines. Alexander prepared himself for an off-key rendition of "Thank You, Mr. Reed," or some other PR-friendly tune. That's when he saw them. 4 children standing together in the back row, same height, same dark hair, same eyes, his eyes. Alexander's smile froze on his face. His heart pounded so loudly he was sure everyone in the room could hear it. "Before we begin," Ms. Chen said, "I'd like to introduce some students who just joined us this semester." She gestured to the 4 look-alike children, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and Mary Reed. Reed, his last name. Alexander gripped the back of a nearby chair to steady himself. It couldn't be. The chance was too small. Yet the evidence was right in front of him, in 4 identical faces that somehow mirrored his own. The children began their song, but Alexander heard nothing. His eyes remained fixed on the quadruplets. Quadruplets. Elena had been carrying 4 babies when he left her. The girl, Mary, caught him staring and whispered something to one of her brothers. The boy looked up, making direct eye contact with Alexander. The child's eyebrow raised slightly in a gesture so familiar that Alexander nearly gasped. It was exactly how he looked when analyzing a problem. The song ended. The room erupted in applause. Alexander clapped mechanically, his mind reeling. "Mr. Reed, would you like to say a few words?" the principal asked. He stepped forward, years of public speaking coming to his rescue. Words came out of his mouth, something about education and the future and the importance of dreams. But his eyes kept drifting back to the 4 children. After his speech, the children lined up to shake his hand. Alexander found himself counting the students, calculating how long until the quadruplets reached him. When they did, he could barely breathe. "Thank you for the computers," said the first boy, Matthew, his small hand disappearing into Alexander's. "Your company makes cool games," said the second boy. The third boy just nodded shyly. Then came Mary. She looked directly into his eyes with a confidence unusual for a child her age. "My mom says you're very smart with money. She teaches us about investing too." Alexander swallowed hard. "Your mom sounds wise. What's her name?" "Elena Reed," Mary replied proudly. "She runs her own business." The room suddenly felt too hot, too small. Alexander loosened his tie as his PR director stepped in, thanking the children and guiding him toward the door. Outside in the hallway, Alexander leaned against the wall, pulling out his phone with shaking hands. "Are you okay, sir?" his assistant asked. "You look like you've seen a ghost." In a way, he had 4 of them. Alexander searched for Elena's business contact information, his heart racing. After 5 years of running away from his past, it had found him anyway. And now he had to face it, and her, and the 4 children who shared his name, his blood, and his face. Children who had no idea who he really was. Alexander sat in his hotel room, staring at his phone. Elena's business number glowed on the screen. He'd cancelled his flight back to San Francisco, dismissed his team for the evening, and ordered room service that now sat cold and untouched. 3 times he'd dialed her number. 3 times he'd hung up before it connected. What would he even say? "Sorry I abandoned you with 4 babies growing inside you. Sorry I blocked your calls and emails and pretended you didn't exist for 5 years. Finally, he took a deep breath and pressed call. "Elena's Events, how can I help you?" The voice was unmistakably hers, though more confident than he remembered. Alexander's throat tightened. "Elena, it's me." The silence that followed seemed endless. "Alexander." Her voice was flat, emotionless. "I wondered when this day would come." "I saw them," he said quietly, "at the school." Another long pause. "I see. Can't we meet, please?" He hated the desperation in his voice, but couldn't hide it. "My office. Tomorrow. 10 a.m. She hung up without waiting for his response. Alexander barely slept that night. His mind raced with questions. Why had she kept his last name? Why hadn't she tried to contact him about the quadruplets? And most puzzling, how had she managed alone? Elena's event planning business occupied a small storefront downtown. A bell jingled as Alexander pushed open the door at exactly 10 o'clock. The space was warm and inviting, comfortable chairs, fresh flowers, and walls covered with photos of smiling people at weddings and parties. Elena emerged from a back office, and Alexander's heart skipped. 5 years had changed her in subtle ways. Her hair was shorter, her stance more confident, but her eyes, they were colder than he remembered when they landed on him. "You look well," he said awkwardly. "Let's talk in my office," she replied, turning without waiting for his response. Her office was neat and organized, with children's drawings pinned to a corkboard behind her desk. Alexander's eyes fixed on them, clearly the work of the Quadruplets. 4 distinct styles, 4 different signatures, all with the last name Reed. Elena closed the door and sat behind her desk, putting a physical barrier between them. "You have questions," she said. "Ask them." Alexander sank into the chair across from her. "Why didn't you tell me about the Quadruplets?" Elena laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You blocked my number, changed your email. Your lawyer returned my letters unopened. How exactly was I supposed to tell you?" The truth hit him like a physical blow. "I didn't know it was quadruplets. I thought just one baby." "Would that have made a difference?" she asked, her eyes piercing his. "Would you have stayed for 1 child but not 4? Alexander had no answer. "I found out it was quadruplets 2 weeks after you left," Elena continued, her voice steady. "High-risk pregnancy. Bed rest for the last 3 months. Emergency C-section at 32 weeks. They spent their first month in the NICU." She paused. "But you don't want to hear about that part, do you?" Shame burned through him. While he'd been raising millions in funding, she'd been fighting to keep 4 tiny babies alive. Alone. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "Sorry doesn't feed 4 children," she replied. "Sorry doesn't pay medical bills or buy car seats or help with midnight feedings." Alexander pulled out his checkbook. "I want to help now. Whatever you need." Elena raised her hand, stopping him. "Put that away. I don't want your money." "Then what do you want?" "Nothing," she said simply. "We've managed 5 years without you. We can manage the rest." Alexander leaned forward. "Then my children too, Elena." "Biologically, yes," she admitted. "But in every way that matters, no. You're just the man who left." "Why did you give them my last name?" he asked, genuinely puzzled. Elena's expression changed slightly, a hint of the woman he once knew showing through her armor. "Because despite everything, I never wanted to erase you completely," she said softly. "And I thought maybe someday you'd want to know them." "I do," Alexander said, surprising himself with how much he meant it. "I want to know them. Please." Elena studied him for a long moment. "They don't know about you. They think their father died before they were born." The words stung, but Alexander understood. It was a kinder story than the truth. "What happens now?" he asked. "That depends," Elena replied. "Are you just passing through town, or are you actually ready to be a father?" The question hummed between them like a challenge, and for the first time in 5 years, Alexander had no idea what his next move should be. Alexander stared at his phone as notification after notification lit up the screen. News alerts, text messages, missed calls from his PR team, board members, and his girlfriend Vanessa. He'd extended his hotel stay for 3 more days, hoping to meet with Elena again to discuss the children. Instead, he found himself trapped in his room as his carefully built world crumbled around him. It had started with a simple tweet. Someone at the school had noticed his strange reaction to the quadruplets and connected the dots. The post showed a photo of Alexander next to a picture of the 4 children. Billionaire Alexander Reed shocked to meet his secret quadruplets during school visit. Within hours, reporters dug up his marriage records to Elena, the timing of his move to Silicon Valley, and the birth certificates of 4 children bearing his name. "Mr. Reed, please answer your phone," his PR director's voice message pleaded. "We need to get ahead of the story." Alexander finally called back his chief of staff, David. "It's a nightmare," David said without preamble. "The board is calling an emergency meeting. Our stock dropped 15% in 2 hours. Vanessa gave an interview saying she had no idea you were ever married, let alone had children. What are people saying?" Alexander asked quietly. "What do you think?" That you're a deadbeat dad who abandoned your pregnant wife and 4 babies to chase billions. That your whole self-made genius story is a lie. Alexander closed his eyes. It's not exactly wrong, is it? That's not the point, David snapped. We need damage control. The narrative needs to be that you didn't know about the quadruplets. That she kept them from you. Alexander's grip tightened on the phone. That would be a lie. She tried to tell me. I blocked her. Then we say you were young and scared, but now you're stepping up, making things right. A knock on the hotel door interrupted them. Alexander opened it to find a young hotel employee looking uncomfortable. Sir, I'm sorry, but there are reporters in the lobby asking for you. Management suggests using the service elevator if you need to leave. Alexander thanked him and closed the door, then turned back to his call. I need to go, David. Tell the board I'll join the meeting virtually in an hour. He hung up and checked his personal email. Amidst the chaos, there was a message from Elena. The children are being bothered at school. Reporters outside our house. This is exactly why I never came after you for support. Call me when you figure out how to fix this. Alexander's heart sank. In his self-centered worry about his own reputation, he hadn't considered how this publicity would affect Elena and the children. He showered and dressed, then connected to the board meeting from his laptop. The faces on the screen looked grim. Alexander, the board chair began, this situation is unprecedented. The company is taking a serious hit. I understand, Alexander replied. We need to consider what's best for ReedTech, another board member added. Perhaps a temporary step back from public-facing duties while this blows over. They continued discussing him as if he weren't there, weighing the damage to the brand, potential investor reactions, media strategy. No one asked about the children, about how he felt discovering he was a father of 4. In the middle of the meeting, Alexander's phone buzzed with a text from Vanessa. It's over. Please don't contact me. My publicist will handle the official announcement. One by one, the pillars of the life he built were collapsing. As the board debated his fate, Alexander opened his browser and searched for Elena's business reviews. They were overwhelmingly positive, filled with comments about her professionalism, creativity, and warmth. One client wrote, Elena somehow managed to plan my perfect wedding while wrangling her 4 little ones. She's superwoman. Alexander smiled faintly. Elena had built something real, a business based on helping people celebrate important moments. Meanwhile, he had built an empire on cutting-edge technology that suddenly felt hollow. Alexander, are you listening? We need your input on the press statement. The board chair's voice broke through his thoughts. Alexander looked up at the faces waiting for his response. These people had never known the real him. They knew the version he'd created after leaving Elena, the version that was now falling apart. I need to make things right, he said finally, not just for the company, for my family. The word family felt strange on his lips, strange but somehow right. They're nervous, Elena said as she led Alexander into her modest home 2 weeks later. The media frenzy had quieted somewhat, though photographers still occasionally camped outside both their locations. Alexander nodded, his own stomach in knots. After days of careful negotiation through phone calls and lawyers, Elena had finally agreed to a supervised meeting with the children. The house was cozy and lived in, toys organized in colorful bins, a large calendar on the wall covered in activities, and photos everywhere. So many photos. Alexander paused at a framed picture of the quadruplets as newborns in the hospital, tiny and fragile. They were so small, he whispered. 2 pounds each, Elena said, watching him. The doctors weren't sure they'd all make it. She gestured to the living room. Wait here. I'll get them. Alexander sat on the edge of the sofa, hands clasped tightly together. He'd faced tough investors, spoken to crowds of thousands, negotiated billion-dollar deals, yet nothing had ever made him this nervous. Footsteps sounded in the hallway. 4 children appeared, standing in a tight cluster behind their mother. They wore matching expressions of curiosity and caution. Children, Elena said gently, this is Mr. Reed, the man I told you about. Alexander noticed she didn't call him their father. That was fair. Hello, he said softly. I'm very happy to meet you, properly this time. The children looked at each other, some silent communication passing between them. Then Mary, clearly the boldest, stepped forward. "Mom says you're our dad. But we thought our dad was dead." Alexander swallowed hard. "I'm sorry about the confusion. That must be very strange for you." "Why weren't you here?" asked Matthew, his small face serious. "If you're our dad, why didn't you live with us?" Elena tensed, but Alexander raised his hand slightly. "It's okay," he told her. "They deserve honest answers." He looked back at the children. "When your mom told me she was going to have a baby, before we knew it was going to be 4 babies, I got scared. I was working very hard on building my company, and I didn't think I could be a good father at the same time." "So you just left?" Luke asked, his voice small. Alexander nodded, shame washing over him. "I did. It was wrong, and it was selfish. Your mom tried to reach me, but I wouldn't listen. I made a terrible mistake." The children absorbed this, their expressions a mixture of confusion and hurt. "Are you rich?" Mark suddenly asked. The others looked at him in surprise. "Mark," Elena warned, but Alexander smiled. "Yes, I am. But I've learned that money isn't what makes people happy. Looking at all of you and seeing what your mom has built here, this home, this family, that's worth more than anything I have." The ice broken, Alexander spent the next hour learning about each child. Matthew showed him a robot he'd built from a kit. Mark brought out drawings that revealed remarkable talent. Luke talked shyly about soccer, brightening when Alexander mentioned he played in college. Mary simply watched, sizing him up with intelligent eyes so much like his own. "Do you want to stay for dinner?" Elena asked when the afternoon was winding down. The invitation surprised them both. "I'd like that," Alexander replied, "if it's okay with everyone." Over a simple meal of spaghetti and garlic bread, Alexander watched in amazement as Elena managed the controlled chaos of 4 5-year-olds. She knew exactly who would eat what, who needed their pasta cut smaller, who would try to sneak extra bread. "You're incredible with them," he said as they cleared dishes together while the children played in the next room. Elena shrugged. "I had to be. There was no choice. I want to help Elena, not just with money, with them." He gestured toward the living room, where laughter erupted over a board game. "They're not a part-time commitment," she said firmly. "They're not a company you can visit when it's convenient." "I know that now," Alexander replied. "I've stepped back from day-to-day operations at Retech, handed over CEO duties to my COO." Elena looked surprised. "You did?" "Some things matter more," he said simply. As he prepared to leave, each child reacted differently. Matthew gave him a formal handshake. Mark showed him one last drawing. Luke offered a quick, shy hug that made Alexander's heart squeeze. Mary simply said, "Will you come back?" "If your mom says it's okay," Alexander answered, looking to Elena. She nodded slightly. "We'll see how it goes." It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't even acceptance yet, but it was a start. "Daddy, look at this one," Mary called out, holding up a glittering birthday crown she had just unwrapped. Alexander smiled, still getting used to being called Daddy after nearly a year of patient visits, careful conversations, and slowly earned trust. Today was special, the Quadruplets' 10th birthday. Their first birthday with him truly present as their father. The backyard of Alexander's new home buzzed with activity. He bought a place just 10 minutes from Elena's house, close enough to be present but not so close as to intrude. It was nothing like his Silicon Valley penthouse, smaller, warmer, filled with children's artwork and family photos. "Matthew, your turn to open a gift," Elena called, somehow maintaining order among the excited children and their friends from school. Alexander watched as his son, the most serious of the 4, carefully unwrapped the package Alexander had chosen especially for him, a professional-grade electronics kit. Matthew's eyes widened with delight. "This is the exact one I wanted. How did you know?" he gasped. "Your mom helped," Alexander admitted, exchanging a smile with Elena across the yard. Their relationship had evolved, not back to romance, but to something new. A partnership based on mutual respect and their shared love for the children. The journey hadn't been easy. There had been arguments, tears, and days when Alexander wondered if he could ever truly make up for his absence. Mark was next, unwrapping art supplies and squealing with joy. Then Luke, who received new soccer gear and immediately wanted to try it out. Finally, Mary opened her last gift, a junior business planning kit that made her beam with pride. "Just like Mom's business," she said, clutching it to her chest. Later, as Elena brought out the birthday cake, actually 4 small cakes, each designed to reflect each child's personality, Alexander felt a wave of emotion wash over him. "Make a wish." The guests chorused as the quadruplets leaned over their flickering candles. Alexander found himself making his own silent wish, that he would never again take for granted the miracle of his children or the strength of the woman who had raised them alone for 5 years. After cake and games, as the party wound down, Alexander helped clean up while the children played with their new gifts. "They seem happy," he said to Elena as they folded up tables. She nodded. "They are. You've been good for them this past year." "And for me," Alexander admitted. "I was so lost before, Elena. Surrounded by success, but completely empty inside." "People can change," she said softly. "I wasn't sure you would, but you proved me wrong." Alexander looked across the yard where his children played, Matthew explaining something to his siblings, hands gesturing excitedly, Mark sketching the scene in a new notebook, Luke demonstrating a soccer trick, and Mary organizing everyone into positions for a game she'd invented. "I missed so much," he said, the regret still sharp even after a year of healing. "You're here now," Elena replied. "That's what matters to them." As the last guests left, the family gathered on the patio. The children were tired but happy, leaning against their parents as the evening cooled. "Best birthday ever," Luke declared, yawning. "Can we do this again next year?" Mark asked. "Of course," Alexander promised. "And every year after that." "Mom too?" Mary asked, looking between them. Elena smiled. "Mom too." Later that night, after driving the sleepy children and Elena home, Alexander returned to his house. He walked through the quiet rooms, picking up forgotten party favors and straightening birthday gifts. On the refrigerator hung a drawing Mark had made months ago, a family portrait with 6 figures. The quadruplets, Elena, and Alexander, all holding hands under a bright sun. "My family" was written across the top in childish letters. Alexander touched the drawing gently. His greatest achievement wasn't the technology he created or the billions he'd earned. It was earning back his place in this family, not through money or power, but through love, patience, and the simple act of showing up day after day. Outside, stars filled the sky over 2 houses not far apart, connected by 4 extraordinary children and the journey of a man who finally understood what truly mattered in life.